On a windswept plain where the trees bent under the weight of winter's breath, there stood a town that has since been swallowed by history, its name barely whispered, its story nearly erased. Yet in the year 1897, this quiet settlement became the stage for something so unholy, so unimaginable, that it burned itself into the marrow of those who survived it. Imagine cobblestone streets echoing with the sound of horse hooves, lanterns swinging in the cold, and smoke curling from chimneys as families huddled against the bite of January nights. On the surface, it looked like any other town of the late 19th century, stitched together by church sermons, small shops, and the silent promises of hard work. But beneath that fragile surface, something darker was spreading, unseen, unheard, until it finally forced its way into the open. The first sign was never taken seriously. Whispers carried between neighbors, muttered in corners of the general store, or exchanged under breath after Sunday service. They spoke of strange noises in the woods just beyond the town's edge, of fires that flickered in the distance when no one was supposed to be there, of markings carved into trees and barns with a precision that felt more ritual than random. Some laughed it off as children playing tricks, others blamed it on vagrants passing through. But the oldest residents, the ones who had lived long enough to see the cycles of land and sky, grew silent whenever such talk arose. Their eyes would shift, their mouths would tighten, and they would mutter something about how the land remembers. For months, fear swirled beneath the polite greetings and Sunday smiles. By day, townsfolk carried on with their lives, bakers kneading dough, farmers hauling grain, mothers scrubbing laundry in icy water. But by night, a nervous energy clung to the air. Curtains were drawn tighter, dogs barked longer, and children were told not to wander even a few feet from their doors. It was as if everyone sensed that something unseen was watching, waiting. And yet, no one dared to speak of it aloud, not in detail, not with certainty. Silence was safer than acknowledgement. But fear has a way of growing when left unspoken. By the start of that bitter winter, the town was already primed for hysteria. Rumors began to carry names. Some claimed they had seen figures gathering at midnight near the old riverbed, hooded and chanting. Others swore they'd caught sight of symbols drawn in ash near the churchyard, symbols no one could interpret but everyone feared. A farmer's wife recounted seeing her livestock refuse to enter the barn, snorting and trembling as though they smelled something unnatural. The preacher, desperate to keep control, warned that sin had taken root in the hearts of men and that the devil himself walked among them. His sermons grew louder, harsher, filled with fire and warning. Each word stoked the unease smoldering in the pews. What made it worse was the isolation. This was not a bustling city where news and logic might soothe panic. This was a small, self-contained world where one person's fear bled into another's until the line between truth and imagination vanished. The local constable tried to calm the whispers, insisting that no crimes had been reported, that no danger had been proven. But he, too, was seen patrolling more often, his lantern bobbing through the streets at hours when decent folk should have been asleep. If nothing was wrong, then why did he seem so restless? The answer came not with a word, but with a discovery. On a moonless night in February, a boy sent to fetch water did not return. His mother, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, set out to find him. She followed the path toward the well, her breath clouding in the cold, until she saw something lying near the edge. It was not her son, but a bundle of rags, soaked and darkened. And nearby, a set of markings carved into the frozen ground. Circles intersecting with lines, a design too deliberate to be accidental. She screamed, and the sound carried through the night, shattering the fragile calm that had held the town together. Neighbors rushed from their homes, lanterns in hand, their faces pale in the flickering light. And though the boy was found safe minutes later, wandering in confusion from the opposite end of town, the damage was already done. The town now believed that something had reached for him, something had marked its presence, and it was only a matter of time before it would take more. From that night forward, nothing felt safe. Doors were barred earlier, prayers grew longer, and every sound seemed like an omen. And then, on a bitter night in 1897, the first body was found. The body discovered that night was only the beginning, but before the horror took full shape, it is necessary to understand the fragile foundation of the town itself. By 1897, this settlement was already teetering under the weight of fear and quiet desperation. Its streets were narrow and muddy, its buildings weather-worn. Most families had been there for generations, clinging to the same patch of earth through floods, harsh winters, and poor harvests. Their lives revolved around the church bell and the rhythm of planting and reaping, but beneath the surface lay a gnawing tension that no one wished to acknowledge. When survival is uncertain, superstition thrives. When faith is tested, suspicion becomes a way of life. The preacher, Reverend Alden, was a man with a booming voice and stern eyes. He warned his flock that temptation was everywhere, that the devil worked hardest in small towns like theirs, where people believed themselves righteous. His sermons grew darker as the weeks passed, filled with threats of eternal fire and hints that wickedness was already among them. To the faithful, his words carried the weight of prophecy. To the skeptical few, his tone felt like a spark tossed into dry straw, waiting for fear to ignite. The mayor, Samuel Kitteridge, stood at the opposite end of the spectrum. A practical man, more concerned with taxes, trade, and keeping order than with talk of demons, he tried to downplay the strange events. Yet even he could not hide his unease when his own horses bolted at the sight of nothing, or when he woke in the night to find unfamiliar ash on his doorstep. Families whispered of division. Husbands and wives bickered about whether to trust the preacher or the mayor. Parents scolded children for telling ghost stories that spread too quickly, yet those same parents bolted their doors twice over once darkness fell. The schoolteacher, Miss Abigail Moore, attempted to soothe her pupils, telling them that the stories were nonsense, but she herself kept a lantern burning until dawn. Fear trickled into every household, invisible yet unrelenting, a poison that could not be contained. It was not long before neighbors began to look at one another differently, more cautiously, more suspiciously. This was not without precedent. The town had carried with it a long memory of past misfortunes. 2 decades earlier, a fever had swept through, taking more than a dozen children. Some said it had been caused by tainted water, others insisted it was a curse placed on the town for some forgotten sin. That memory had never fully healed, and in 1897 it resurfaced, old scars reopening, shaping the way people saw the unexplained. Every tragedy became a sign, every misstep a possible clue. When a farmer's wife miscarried, she said it was because something evil walks past our home at night. When a hunter's dog vanished into the woods, the men at the tavern muttered about spirits leading animals away. Whether true or not, each tale fed into the growing belief that forces beyond human understanding were now at work. Then came the reports of gatherings. A farmer swore he had seen figures cloaked in black near the tree-line. Another claimed to have heard voices chanting, though when he drew closer, the woods fell silent as if mocking his intrusion. No one wanted to admit it openly, but everyone knew the implication: witchcraft, pagan rites, or something worse. In a deeply religious community, such whispers carried the weight of blasphemy. To accuse without proof was dangerous, but to remain silent felt like inviting doom. The town was being pulled apart, not by violence yet, but by the tension of suspicion. The authorities did little to ease the strain. The constable, Elias Booker, dismissed the rumors, claiming drunken eyes saw shapes where there were none. Yet even he was seen walking the streets more often, hand resting on the handle of his revolver. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named Hollis Griggs, warned that if the law would not act, then the people must protect themselves. He gathered a few men into a watch group, patrolling at night with rifles. Others saw this as necessary, but some whispered that the watchmen themselves were being drawn into the madness, mistaking shadows for intruders and imagining footsteps where none existed. Tension reached a fever pitch when children began speaking of things they should not have known. A girl recited a strange prayer in class, words that made the schoolteacher's skin crawl. A boy drew symbols in the dirt that matched the markings seen on barns and in the woods. Parents denied teaching them such things, and the children claimed they had heard it in dreams. To some, this was evidence that the evil had already seeped into the youngest and most innocent. To others, it was proof that children, too, had become instruments of lies and suspicion. Fear was now consuming even the bonds of blood. Through it all, life staggered on. Shops opened, bread was sold, sermons were preached. But the faces were strained, the laughter gone. Every cough was met with dread, every unfamiliar footprint on the road with alarm. The town stood balanced on the edge of a knife, trying to act normal while shadows thickened around them. It was only a matter of time before the fragile fabric tore, revealing what lay beneath. And then, as if summoned by the collective fear of the people, the reports of a secret midnight gathering began to circulate. Someone claimed they had seen it, others hinted they knew who had been there, but no one dared speak their names aloud. Fear had at last given birth to silence, and in that silence, suspicion grew louder than any voice could. The rumors of secret gatherings might have remained whispers if not for what came next. It began with the animals. Farmers rose at dawn to find their livestock slain in ways that defied explanation. Cows with their throats slit, sheep arranged in crude circles, and chickens stripped of feathers yet untouched by scavengers. What disturbed the townsfolk most was not the deaths themselves but the precision with which the acts were carried out. No wolf or fox could carve symbols into the hides of animals. No predator arranged bodies into patterns resembling circles intersecting with triangles. It was not the work of hunger, it was the work of intention. The constable dismissed the first reports, suggesting wild dogs or a pack of coyotes had grown bold. But even he could not explain the symbols scorched into barn doors or the perfectly symmetrical cuts that adorned the flesh. A boy sent to gather eggs ran screaming when he discovered blood pooled in neat spirals across the dirt floor of a coop. His cries brought half the town running, and when they saw the sight themselves, not one among them spoke. It was as though to speak would make it real. The preacher thundered that Satan himself was walking their streets, demanding that the town turn to prayer. The mayor urged patience, but his voice was weaker now, drowned beneath the rising storm of superstition. And then, as if mocking their hesitation, the first human victim appeared. Her name was Clara Jameson, a young woman of barely 20, known for her quiet nature and kind smile. She had gone missing one evening on her walk home from the mill. At first, her absence was explained away, perhaps she had lingered with a friend, perhaps she had visited her sister in the next town. But when morning came and she did not appear, her parents searched the road. They found her not far from the river, lying on the frozen ground. The sight of her sent her mother into a fit of screams that carried through the hills. Clara's death was unlike anything the town had ever witnessed. Her body bore no signs of robbery, no bruises that spoke of a struggle. Instead, carved into her skin were markings, intricate designs that matched the symbols found on barns and in the dirt near the woods. The coroner, pale and trembling, whispered to the constable that the cuts were deliberate, placed with care. They were neither random violence nor the result of drunken cruelty. These were ritualistic. Someone had turned her into an offering. Word spread with terrifying speed. Within hours, every home buzzed with fear. Mothers pulled their children close, fathers barred their doors. The preacher declared that the devil was demanding sacrifices, that the town was being tested. Some whispered that Clara herself had been involved, that her silence and solitary walks were signs of secrets kept. Others dismissed this as cruelty born from panic, yet the rumors stuck like thorns in flesh. In times of fear, the dead are seldom remembered kindly. The investigation brought no comfort. Clara's belongings were untouched, her purse still on her shoulder, her shoes unscuffed. No sign of struggle, no tracks in the snow except her own. It was as if she had walked willingly to her fate, or worse, as if the earth itself had swallowed her and then set her back down, altered and broken. The constable tried to speak of reason, of a killer hiding among them, but reason had already lost its grip. To the townsfolk, this was no mere crime. This was a message. The coroner, a man not prone to theatrics, confided in the mayor that he had seen these markings once before, long ago, in a book of strange lore tucked away in his late father's library. He could not recall the exact details, only that the shapes were tied to old rites meant to summon or banish. His words leaked into the community, twisted and exaggerated, until people began to whisper that Clara had been taken as part of a pact. A deal struck with something inhuman. Whether to curse the town or save it depended on who told the story. Suspicion swelled like a tide. Old grudges resurfaced, old secrets were dredged up. One man accused his neighbor of wandering the woods at night. Another swore he had seen a light in the schoolhouse after midnight, and what teacher needed to be at her desk when the children slept. The accused defended themselves desperately, but each denial only fanned the flames of mistrust. A glance held too long, a word spoken too sharply, suddenly it was evidence. The town was eating itself alive, one rumor at a time. Yet the most chilling discovery came when Clara's family, in their grief, searched her small room. Beneath her bed they found a folded scrap of paper. On it were drawings, circles, lines, and a crude attempt at the very symbols carved into her flesh. The ink was fresh, the paper smudged by her hand. Her parents wept, insisting she had no knowledge of such things. But others were not so quick to dismiss it. Had Clara been dabbling in forbidden practices? Was she a victim, or was she, in some way, a willing participant? No answer could be proven, and so suspicion lingered like smoke in the air. When the preacher addressed the town again, his voice cracked with both fury and fear. He claimed that Clara's death was a warning, that more would follow if the community did not purge itself of corruption. He called for confessions, for neighbors to expose neighbors, for the guilty to be brought into the light. The crowd listened with wide eyes and pale faces, caught between terror and obedience. The mayor tried to speak afterward, but his voice was drowned by the rising hum of paranoia. Reason was being buried beneath hysteria. And still, no one could explain the most unsettling detail of all. The markings carved into Clara's flesh, the same ones found on barns and trees, were drawn with such precision that they matched one another exactly, as though copied from the same unseen hand. Too exact for coincidence, too deliberate for chance. The coroner's words returned again and again to those who had heard them, these were not the careless strokes of a murderer. They were the practiced designs of someone who believed in what they were doing. Someone who had studied. Someone who belonged not to a moment of madness, but to a ritual. The discovery of Clara's body should have brought unity, but instead it tore the town further apart. Fear has a way of reshaping the faces you've known your whole life, and soon every friendly smile looked like a mask hiding darker intentions. As the days passed, accusations spread like wildfire, names whispered in kitchens, in taverns, in pews. The line between rumor and truth blurred until no one could be certain who to trust. Every family carried secrets, and now each secret became a possible clue to something sinister. The constable tried to form an orderly investigation. He interviewed the townsfolk one by one, taking notes in his worn ledger, but the answers he received only deepened the mystery. The millworker swore he saw a cloaked figure walking toward the woods on the night Clara disappeared. The blacksmith insisted he heard chanting beyond the river, voices too low and steady to belong to children playing. An old widow claimed she had found ash symbols drawn on her doorstep, though when pressed, she could not produce them. None of it was proof, yet each story added another layer of dread. The constable's ledger filled with names, crossed out and rewritten, suspects multiplying faster than he could keep track. Outsiders quickly became the most obvious targets. A traveling salesman who had arrived weeks earlier found himself followed by angry stares. He had been selling tinctures and healing tonics, bottles that some whispered were nothing more than witches' brews. When his wagon was searched, nothing incriminating was found, just cheap bottles of herbs and alcohol, but the suspicion lingered. A drifter who slept near the train tracks was accused of spying on townsfolk at night. When questioned, he swore he was only looking for work, but the town did not believe him. Fear made outsiders convenient scapegoats, but deep down, many suspected the evil was closer to home. That suspicion soon turned inward. Old grievances resurfaced in the guise of evidence. The blacksmith's apprentice was accused because his father had once been caught stealing chickens years before. The schoolteacher was whispered about because she read strange books, classics and philosophy that most could not understand. A mother turned on her neighbor, insisting she had seen her sneaking out at night with a lantern, though it later came out the woman was visiting her sister who had taken ill. Logic no longer mattered. To be accused was to be guilty in the eyes of many, and the circle of blame widened with each passing day. The preacher fueled the fire. Standing at the pulpit, his voice shaking the rafters, he declared that sinners walked among them, that evil had infiltrated their homes. He demanded that the guilty confess before more innocent lives were claimed. His sermons painted vivid images of hellfire, of demons feasting on souls, of rituals that brought down God's wrath. To some, his words were a comfort, clarity in chaos. To others, they were poison, sharpening suspicions until even the most loyal friendships cracked under the weight of doubt. Children began to report on their parents, neighbors on their friends. The town was unraveling from within. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While cleaning her late daughter's room, Clara's mother unearthed a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a diary. Its pages were filled with her delicate handwriting, recounting her daily life, small joys, and private fears. But scattered between these mundane notes were darker entries. Descriptions of symbols she had seen carved in the woods. Sketches of strange shapes she claimed had appeared in her dreams. And then, most disturbing of all, passages describing a ceremony she had been invited to witness. The words were vague, written with hesitation, but clear enough to suggest that Clara had known more than she had ever spoken aloud. The diary was brought to the constable, then to the preacher, then whispered about from house to house. Some believed Clara had been lured against her will, documenting her fear in those secret pages. Others insisted the diary was proof of her involvement, that she had been drawn willingly into something forbidden and had paid the price. The town split further, half mourning her as a victim, half condemning her as a participant. But one detail remained undeniable: Clara had described, in detail, symbols that matched those carved into her skin. How could she have known them unless she had seen them before? The discovery of the diary set off a frenzy of searching. Suddenly every home was suspected of hiding secrets. Basements were checked for hidden rooms, barns scoured for signs of gatherings. Parents tore through their children's belongings in fear of finding something incriminating. And in one such search, another chilling piece of evidence surfaced. In the church's own vestry, tucked inside an old hymnal, someone found scraps of parchment bearing the same symbols again. The ink was smeared, the lines shaky, but unmistakable. The hymnal had been handled by dozens of people, making it impossible to know whose hand had left it there. To discover such markings within the walls of God's house was a shock too great for many to bear. If even the church was not safe, then where could purity be found? As suspicion tightened its grip, even the constable himself came under scrutiny. Why had he failed to find the killer? Why did his ledger contain names that some claimed were innocent, while others were never written down at all? Was he protecting someone? Was he part of it? The questions spread like disease, infecting every corner of the town's fragile trust. He denied the accusations, his voice cracking with anger, but his denials did little to calm the tide. In an atmosphere where proof was scarce and fear abundant, the absence of evidence became evidence itself. The mayor pleaded for patience, insisting that the truth would reveal itself in time, but his words fell flat. What the people wanted was not patience, they wanted answers. And they wanted someone to blame. Vigilante groups began to form, men with rifles prowling the streets, women clutching rosaries as they whispered prayers of protection. Each night, the town grew quieter, doors locked earlier, lamps extinguished sooner, as if darkness itself were watching. Yet beneath the silence, tension pulsed like a drumbeat, waiting for the next strike. And so the stage was set. A town where no one trusted their neighbor, where fear had turned to anger, and where every whispered rumor could lead to violence. The diary remained the most haunting clue of all, its pages filled with half-revealed truths and unanswered questions. Who had invited Clara to witness the ceremony she described? Who else had been there? And, most terrifying of all, who among them still walked freely, hiding their knowledge, waiting for the next night to fall? The diary had unsettled everyone, but what followed turned fear into open terror. For weeks, townsfolk had whispered of gatherings in the woods, fires flickering in the distance, voices drifting on the wind, shadows moving where no one should have been. Most dismissed these as tricks of the imagination, fear making people see and hear what they wanted to. But then, undeniable evidence surfaced. A hunter, returning late one evening, stumbled upon a clearing deep within the trees. In the center stood a crude stone altar, its surface blackened with soot. Around it, the ground was scarred with burn marks in precise circles, as though fires had been lit in a deliberate pattern. The hunter fled in terror, telling anyone who would listen what he had seen. At first, people thought he was drunk, exaggerating after too much whiskey. But when a group of men went to the site the next day, they found the same altar, the same burn marks, and something worse, animal bones scattered in a ring, charred and brittle, as if offered up to flames. Word of the discovery spread faster than the winter wind. Suddenly, every rumor felt real, every shadow heavier with threat. Parents forbade children from stepping outside after dark. Farmers abandoned fields nearest to the woods. The preacher declared that the devil himself had claimed the forest as his domain. To the people, this was no longer speculation. There were rituals being performed. There was worship of something unholy. And someone among them was leading it. The constable tried to investigate methodically, but the community's patience had run thin. They demanded arrests, demanded justice, demanded blood. The preacher's sermons grew wilder, laced with fire and brimstone, his voice echoing through the rafters as he called for confession. But instead of calming the people, his words pushed them closer to the edge. Suspicion hardened into action. Vigilante patrols doubled in size, and men began carrying rifles even into the church pews. No one felt safe, not even in God's house. Then came the night when a group of farmers swore they had seen the ritual themselves. They had been patrolling near the woods when they noticed flickering light through the trees. Creeping closer, they claimed to have seen figures in cloaks, moving in a circle around a great fire. They described chanting, low, rhythmic, not like any hymn they knew. Some swore they recognized the voices, even the gait of certain figures. One man insisted he saw the blacksmith's broad shoulders, another claimed he glimpsed the preacher's distinctive hat. But when pressed the next day, none could agree. The only thing they all confirmed was the fire, the chanting, and the masks, grotesque, crudely made from wood and cloth, designed to hide every feature. Whoever was behind the rituals wanted to be recognized only by their symbols, not their faces. The town erupted in chaos. Some demanded the blacksmith's arrest, others accused the preacher of leading a double life. Families that had known each other for decades now turned away in suspicion. At night, the sound of gunshots echoed as men fired at shadows. Women locked themselves in their homes with their children, praying the evil would pass over them. The woods, once a place of hunting and gathering, became a cursed boundary. Few dared approach, yet everyone felt its pull, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. Then, one voice broke the silence. A woman named Martha Pike, known for her frail health and quiet demeanor, came forward in trembling confession. She claimed she had seen the ritual firsthand, that she had stumbled upon the gathering while searching for her lost goat. Her story was chilling. She described men and women in cloaks, their faces hidden, chanting words she did not understand. At the center of the circle stood a figure taller than the rest, raising a knife above the altar. She swore she saw blood run down its surface, though whether animal or human she could not say. Martha's voice shook as she admitted she had recognized someone beneath the mask, not by face, but by the sound of their voice. She would not say the name aloud, only that it was someone respected, someone trusted. Her refusal to reveal the identity only inflamed paranoia. Some accused her of lying for attention, others demanded she tell the truth. But Martha wept, insisting that if she spoke the name, her life would be in danger. The town was split. Half wanted to protect her, half wanted to drag the name from her lips by force. That night, her house was pelted with stones, neighbors shouting that she was protecting the guilty. By morning, she had vanished. Her door was left ajar, her bed unslept in, her belongings untouched. No tracks led away from her home. It was as if she had dissolved into the night. Her disappearance became another piece of evidence for both sides. Some claimed it proved she had been silenced by the cult. Others insisted she had run away in guilt, perhaps even as one of them. The constable's attempts to calm the storm were useless. He could no longer control the tide of fear. The preacher seized the moment, declaring that the devil demanded sacrifice, and unless the guilty were revealed, the entire town would be consumed. As days turned to weeks, hysteria gave way to violence. Neighbors attacked one another in the streets over whispered suspicions. A barn was set ablaze after symbols were found carved into its beams. The owner swore he had no knowledge of how they got there, but the mob would not listen. He barely escaped with his life, his property reduced to ashes. No one dared intervene. To speak against the mob was to draw suspicion upon oneself. Meanwhile, the forest clearing grew stranger still. Patrols who ventured there claimed the patterns of the burn marks had changed, as though new fires had been lit, new ceremonies performed. Some insisted they saw fresh blood staining the altar stone, though when examined in daylight it appeared clean. Others brought back fragments of wood carved with the same markings found on Clara's skin. Each discovery deepened the dread, each new sign proof that the rituals were not fading but growing bolder. The people wanted a leader to blame, someone to drag into the light. They wanted certainty in the chaos. And when Martha Pike's story was whispered again, one phrase stood out, a voice she recognized, belonging to someone respected. That detail lodged itself in the town's collective mind like a thorn. Who among them carried authority, trust, and the ability to lead others into such darkness? Who could stand before them in daylight as a neighbor, yet by night conduct unholy ceremonies in the woods? The answer, many believed, was closer than anyone dared to admit. And when the next witness stepped forward, trembling with fear, their words confirmed the town's worst suspicion. "I saw them," the man whispered, eyes darting as if the shadows themselves might punish him for speaking. "I saw who was leading it." The witness's words fell upon the town like a spark in dry tinder. He was an older man, Samuel Dyer, a recluse who rarely spoke more than a few sentences in church. His sudden willingness to testify carried weight. His voice was low, hoarse, as if each syllable cost him dearly. He swore he had seen the ritual with his own eyes. Unlike Martha Pike, he did not hesitate to name a suspect. The name struck the congregation like a thunderclap: Reverend Josiah Whitlock. The preacher. The man who had spent weeks warning of the devil's grip, who had thundered from the pulpit about sin, fire, and damnation. The very figure the people had looked to for guidance. Samuel's claim was simple but devastating. He said he had followed the chanting in the woods, seen the cloaked figures, and when the leader pulled back his hood to lift the knife high, Samuel had glimpsed the preacher's face in the glow of firelight. For a moment, silence choked the room. The preacher himself stood stunned, his face pale but his eyes fierce. Then he erupted, thundering that Samuel was possessed, that lies dripped from his mouth like poison. The crowd split instantly, some gasped in horror, others muttered in defense of their spiritual leader. Samuel shook as he repeated his claim, insisting he had no reason to lie. "I know what I saw," he rasped. "And God strike me down if I speak false." The town was plunged into pandemonium. Some demanded the preacher's immediate arrest, others shouted that Satan had tricked Samuel into seeing false visions. The constable tried to restore order, but his shouts were drowned in the storm of voices. Fear, suspicion, and betrayal churned together until reason could no longer hold. That night, the preacher barricaded himself in his home, his loyal followers standing guard outside with rifles. They swore their leader was innocent, that he was being framed by the devil or by jealous men. But across town, Samuel Dyer sat trembling, convinced that he had signed his own death warrant by speaking the truth. His windows were shattered with rocks before dawn, and strange symbols were found scrawled on his door, drawn in what looked like ash. He swore it was a warning from the cult, that they would silence him next. As the days unfolded, the town fractured into factions. Some believed wholeheartedly that the preacher was guilty, that his fiery sermons had been nothing more than a smokescreen for his darker calling. Others clung desperately to him, refusing to believe that the man who had christened their children, who had buried their dead, could possibly serve the devil. Families divided. Friends of decades ceased speaking. Markets went quiet as people refused to buy bread from those they suspected of standing on the wrong side. In the middle of it all, strange occurrences multiplied. More fires burned in the woods. Livestock disappeared, their remains found mutilated days later. A farmer swore he saw figures moving in his fields at night, torches in hand, leaving behind trampled crops and carved symbols burned into the earth. Even those who doubted the preacher's guilt could not deny that something malevolent was at work. The constable, desperate to restore peace, called a meeting in the town hall. It was a tense affair, with rifles stacked at the door and men keeping hands on knives at their belts. He demanded evidence, not rumors. Yet all anyone could offer were stories, sightings of cloaked figures, fires, chanting, and the chilling testimonies of Martha Pike and Samuel Dyer. But Martha was gone, vanished without a trace. Samuel was terrified, his word already dismissed as either holy truth or blasphemous lie. No physical proof tied the preacher to the rituals. And then, just as the meeting threatened to collapse into chaos, another voice rose. This time it was Abigail, the widow of a mill worker who had died months earlier in an accident. She stood trembling, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes darting toward the preacher. In a quivering voice, she told the crowd that her late husband had confessed something before his death. He had been approached by men in masks, urged to join their gatherings. He had refused, but he said the one who led them spoke with the same cadence, the same thunderous rhythm as the preacher himself. The gasp that followed was sharp, cutting through the hall. Abigail wept as she begged the crowd to understand that she had not wanted to speak ill of the man who baptized her children. But with her husband gone and fear consuming the town, she could no longer stay silent. She was convinced the preacher had lured her husband into the woods, and that his accident at the mill had not been an accident at all. The preacher roared his innocence, slamming his fist on the table so hard the lanterns rattled. His eyes blazed as he swore before God that he had nothing to do with such evil. But the seed had been planted, and the soil of fear was fertile. By the time the meeting ended, whispers had already begun. Maybe Samuel was right. Maybe the widow speaks truth. Maybe their preacher had been leading them into darkness all along. From that night forward, madness seeped deeper into the town. Some of the preacher's loyalists began following him everywhere, fearful he might be taken or killed. Others began plotting how to drag him into the woods and prove his guilt with their own eyes. And in the middle of it all, the rituals continued. Fires burned brighter. Chanting carried farther. Some swore the voices had multiplied, as if the congregation in the woods had grown larger. One morning, the constable found a new horror waiting on the steps of the church. A small wooden effigy, crudely carved in the likeness of the preacher, lay smeared with blood. Around its neck hung a scrap of cloth, embroidered with a symbol that matched the one burned into Clara's skin months earlier. The message was clear: someone, somewhere, wanted the town to believe their preacher was at the heart of the evil. Whether it was truth or manipulation remained uncertain. But the effect was undeniable. The people had reached their breaking point. And when the next ritual fire lit up the woods, brighter and larger than ever before, a mob formed with one singular purpose. They would storm the forest, drag the guilty into the light, and end the madness once and for all. What they found waiting in the clearing, however, was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The night was unnaturally still as the mob assembled, their lanterns glowing like fireflies against the endless dark. Men carried rifles, axes, and torches. Women clutched rosaries, whispering prayers with trembling lips. Even children were dragged along by parents who insisted that the evil must be witnessed to be defeated. There was no law in their eyes that night, no constable strong enough to hold them back. They marched toward the woods as though into battle, driven by a mixture of fear and rage that left no room for hesitation. The forest loomed like a living wall, its branches twisted together to form a canopy that swallowed the moonlight. The mob pushed forward, their boots crunching on frozen leaves, their breath rising in clouds. As they neared the clearing, the sound reached them first, a low, rhythmic chanting, deep and layered, as though 100 voices moved in perfect unison. It was not the sound of drunken men or idle gatherings. It was ritual. It was deliberate. The closer they came, the more the air seemed to vibrate. The chanting grew louder, accompanied by the steady beat of something that sounded like drums, or perhaps it was only the pounding of their own hearts. Then came the glow. Through the trees, flickering firelight painted the branches red and gold. The mob halted at the edge of the clearing, every man and woman caught between dread and fury. What they saw seared itself into their memory. The altar was ablaze with candles. Around it, hooded figures stood in a perfect circle, their movements synchronized, their hands raised to the sky. The fire at the center roared unnaturally high, its flames bending as if pulled by some unseen force. And at the forefront stood the leader, cloaked in black, face hidden behind a grotesque mask carved with twisting patterns. In his hands he held a long knife that gleamed with firelight. Upon the altar lay something shrouded in cloth, its shape human. A collective gasp rippled through the mob. Some swore they saw the figure on the altar move, a faint twitch of the arm, a shift beneath the fabric. If it was true, the cult was not sacrificing animals anymore. They had moved on to human offerings. Rage overpowered fear. With a cry, the mob surged forward, torches high, weapons raised. The chanting broke into chaos as the cloaked figures scattered like crows, vanishing into the dark with unnatural speed. Some fired shots into the trees, but the bullets struck nothing. The fire roared higher, sparks raining down on the clearing. And in the midst of it all, the leader remained, unmoving, the knife still raised. For a terrible moment, it seemed he might finish the ritual before their eyes. But as the mob closed in, he dropped the blade and disappeared into the shadows. Several men gave chase, but the forest swallowed him whole. What remained was the altar, the fire, and the shape lying upon the stone. With trembling hands, the constable pulled away the cloth. It was Martha Pike. Her eyes were wide open, glassy and unblinking. Her lips were stained dark, as though she had been forced to drink something before her death. The townsfolk recoiled in horror. Here was the woman who had spoken of the cult, who had vanished without explanation, now laid out as a sacrifice for all to see. The mob erupted in cries, some weeping, others swearing vengeance. The preacher, who had been dragged into the clearing by those who suspected him, fell to his knees at the sight, his face twisted in grief. He swore aloud that he had no hand in this, that he had loved Martha like a sister in Christ. But his protests were drowned in the roar of the crowd. To many, this was proof enough. Martha had accused someone powerful. She had vanished. And now she was dead upon the altar. Accusations flew like arrows. Some shouted that the preacher had silenced her. Others insisted the constable had failed them all. Neighbors turned on each other with fists and fury, demanding answers no one could give. The clearing became a battlefield, not of swords and bullets, but of suspicion and hysteria. Torches were thrown. Fists met flesh. Blood stained the snow. In the chaos, the altar fire consumed the last remnants of Martha's body. Whether by accident or by intent, the flames devoured her until nothing but ash remained. Her death could no longer be investigated, her body no longer examined. Only memory and rumor remained, fertile soil for paranoia. By the time the mob staggered back to town, the community was shattered. Families that had marched together returned as enemies. The preacher, though still free, was under constant watch, his every word dissected for hidden meaning. Samuel Dyer, the old recluse, was found beaten nearly to death outside his cabin, his warning now seen as dangerous truth. And through it all, the fires in the woods continued to burn, each night brighter, each chant louder, as if mocking the town's futile attempts at control. The people had set out to end the madness. Instead, they had fed it. And in the ashes of Martha Pike, the town began to realize a horrifying truth: this was not hysteria born of fear alone. Something, or someone, was deliberately feeding the frenzy, pushing them toward violence, ensuring that no peace could ever return. But the question remained: who stood to gain from their destruction? The days following Martha Pike's death left the town in a state beyond fear. It was frenzy, unshackled and raw. The clearing in the woods had burned itself into their minds, a vision of fire, chanting, and blood that no one could forget. But instead of unity against a common enemy, the town fractured deeper than ever before. Accusations spread like wildfire, licking into every corner, consuming every bond of trust. Neighbors who had once shared meals now refused to look one another in the eye. Children whispered that their teachers were part of the cult. Farmers left offerings of salt and iron on their fences, believing it would ward off the unholy. Even the constable's authority had collapsed. His word no longer carried weight. When he tried to call for calm, people shouted him down, declaring him either incompetent or complicit. And then came the messages. Slips of parchment appeared on doorsteps in the dead of night, written in smeared ink, bearing cryptic warnings: "We are among you. The fire grows. Do not resist." No one knew who left them. Some claimed the cult was taunting them, others whispered that their own neighbors wrote the notes to sow chaos. But whatever the source, the effect was the same: paranoia tightened its grip. The preacher, still under suspicion, grew more desperate with every sermon. His words were harsher now, almost frantic. He thundered about damnation, warning that the devil himself walked among them, taking familiar faces to mask his deeds. Yet with every word, the congregation split further. Some clung to him with renewed devotion, convinced that only he could deliver them. Others saw every verse, every fiery declaration, as a confession hidden in plain sight. The mob's violence escalated. It was no longer enough to whisper suspicion. People began acting on it. One night, the blacksmith's home was set ablaze after men swore they had seen him among the hooded figures in the woods. His family barely escaped, their lives shattered in an instant. Days later, Samuel Dyer, the old recluse whose testimony had pointed to the preacher, was found dead in his cabin. His throat had been cut ear to ear, and on the wall above his bed was scrawled the same symbol that had marked Clara's skin months before. The murder shook the town to its core. To some, it was proof the cult was real and growing bolder, willing to kill anyone who dared speak truth. To others, it was simply another act of hysteria, a neighbor settling scores under the cloak of superstition. Either way, Samuel's death silenced voices. Few dared speak aloud what they had seen or suspected, afraid of meeting the same fate. At the same time, the rituals in the forest became impossible to ignore. Nearly every night, flames lit the horizon, visible even from the farthest farms. Some claimed the chants grew louder, carrying over the fields like a curse. One boy, barely 12, swore he saw faces staring from the tree line, blank masks reflecting the firelight, though when the men searched, they found nothing but empty woods. Yet each new sighting chipped away at sanity. The line between truth and imagination blurred until no one could say with certainty what was real. Fear twisted into hunger for control. The town elders gathered and declared that the only way to cleanse the evil was through trial and punishment. They began rounding up those most suspected: the blacksmith's apprentice, a farmer's widow, even a midwife who had once treated Clara before her strange death. Evidence was irrelevant, suspicion was enough. In makeshift trials held in barns and basements, men played judge, jury, and executioner. Some accused were driven out into the snow. Others were beaten bloody. A few simply disappeared, never seen again. The preacher himself barely avoided the same fate. A faction within the mob demanded his hanging, but his loyalists protected him, insisting that the devil was using lies to weaken their faith. The preacher, cornered and raging, swore that God would reveal the truth in fire and blood. His words, meant as reassurance, sounded like a curse. The constable tried once more to intervene. He begged the town to stop, to seek evidence instead of violence. But as he spoke, a new horror was discovered, fresh markings on the church door. The same symbols from the woods, carved deep into the wood, smeared with ash and what looked disturbingly like blood. The message was unmistakable, the cult had claimed the house of God itself. That night, no one slept. Some prayed in trembling whispers, others sharpened knives, waiting for whatever horror the next day might bring. But beneath it all was a deeper, unspoken dread. What if the cult was not outsiders at all? What if it was them, neighbors, friends, even family, playing both roles, victim and villain alike? When dawn came, a child was missing. The Miller family woke to find their daughter's bed empty, her window wide open, snow tracked in across the floorboards. Panic consumed the town. Search parties scoured the woods, shouting her name until their voices broke. But the girl was nowhere to be found. By nightfall, a single scrap of her dress was discovered near the clearing, tied to a branch like a banner. The town had thought Martha Pike's death was the breaking point. They were wrong. The missing child was worse than any fire or symbol. It was personal, intimate, unbearable. And it made one thing certain, whether preacher, farmer, or unseen hand, someone was orchestrating terror with precision. And now, with a child's life at stake, the town's fragile boundary between reason and madness would be obliterated. The disappearance of young Eliza Miller was the spark that turned dread into outright frenzy. Every parent clutched their children tighter, every man swore he would tear the woods apart until she was found. The girl had been just 9 years old, bright, gentle, known to sing hymns as she skipped down the dusty road. Her absence left the town hollow, as though innocence itself had been stolen. Search parties were formed instantly, dozens of men armed with rifles and lanterns fanning into the forest. They called her name again and again, their voices echoing through the frozen trees, met only with silence. But the deeper they went, the more they found signs that chilled their blood. Torn fabric snagged on brambles. Strange footprints, bare feet, despite the snow, circling the trees. Symbols carved freshly into bark, each one identical to the marks found on Clara's body months earlier. One group swore they heard singing, faint and high-pitched, drifting through the branches. It sounded like a child's voice, calling a melody no one recognized. They ran toward it, hearts pounding, but found nothing. Only the echo lingered, mocking them. Others claimed they saw figures darting between the trees, too fast to follow, cloaks flaring in the firelight of unseen torches. Each report deepened the sense that the cult was not only real, but toying with them, leading them deeper, feeding their fear. By the second night, the town gathered at the church, demanding answers. Mothers wept, fathers shouted, fists slammed against pews. Some accused the preacher again, declaring that his fiery sermons had been a distraction from his darker deeds. Others insisted the constable had failed them, too cowardly to confront the evil directly. The preacher, wild-eyed and hoarse from shouting, raised his Bible high and swore he would lead the search himself, that God would give him strength to bring Eliza home. His followers roared approval, but others muttered darkly that he was only buying time, guiding them away from the truth. And then came the discovery. On the third night, deep in the clearing, the searchers found a crude circle of stones. At its center lay Eliza's doll, its head torn off, its dress stained dark. Around it, animal bones were arranged in patterns too deliberate to be chance. The searchers stood frozen, unable to speak. It was not Eliza's body, but it was proof she had been there. Proof she was being used in the rituals. When the doll was brought back to town, mothers screamed and fainted, fathers broke into sobs or into rages. Fear transformed into a singular hunger for blood. If the cult would take a child, there could be no mercy, no restraint. The town declared war. Patrols doubled, then tripled. Men walked the streets at all hours, rifles loaded, eyes searching every shadow. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Anyone seen moving after dark was stopped, questioned, sometimes beaten. Whispers turned into accusations, and accusations turned into assaults. One family was dragged from their home and tied to a tree while the mob shouted questions, demanding to know where Eliza was. They were released only when no evidence appeared, but the damage was done. No one was safe. The constable, once the figure of order, was now a broken man. He tried to argue for patience, for method, but the town no longer listened. Authority had shifted to the mob, to the loudest voices, to the preachers of vengeance rather than justice. The preacher himself, caught between worship and suspicion, played both sides. In his sermons he declared that the cult was Satan's work and that only faith could drive it back. But in whispers, some claimed they had seen him slip into the woods at night, carrying a lantern. Then, on the fourth night, the bells of the church rang out without human hand. The sound split the darkness, harsh and discordant, echoing across the snowbound fields. People rushed into the streets, thinking it was a signal. The church stood open, its doors creaking in the wind. Inside, the pews were empty, but on the altar lay a bundle. A bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with twine, the shape unmistakably human-sized. The crowd surged forward, the preacher at the front, tears in his eyes. With trembling hands he pulled the cloth away. Inside was no child, but a carcass of a goat, its body arranged grotesquely to resemble a girl. Around its neck hung Eliza's ribbon, the one she had worn in her hair the day she vanished. The scream that followed shook the rafters. Mothers wailed, fathers cursed, children clung to skirts in terror. To the people, it was not just cruelty, it was a message. The cult was mocking them, desecrating their holiest place with symbols of their helplessness. From that night onward, madness consumed them. Vigilantes patrolled not just the woods, but their neighbors' homes. Doors were kicked in at midnight. Men dragged their rivals into the street, demanding confessions. Women were accused of witchcraft for brewing herbs, midwives accused of poisoning infants. Each act of violence fed the next, until the town became indistinguishable from the very evil it claimed to fight. And yet, beneath the chaos, one horrifying truth gnawed at those few still capable of reason: if the cult was so bold, so cruel, so relentless, how could it be stopped by mere men? And worse, if Eliza's ribbon had been left behind, what had become of Eliza herself? By the week's end, another fire lit the horizon. Larger than any before, its glow turned the night sky red. The chanting carried farther, louder, as though hundreds of voices now filled the forest. The town gathered at the edge of the trees, torches shaking in their hands, listening to the sound of ritual echoing through the night. Some swore they heard a child's voice among the chorus. High, plaintive, desperate. A voice that could only belong to Eliza. And with that sound, the fragile thread that still held the town together snapped. They would march into the woods once more, not in search of truth or order, but in search of salvation, or vengeance. Whatever waited for them in the clearing would decide whether the town survived, or whether it was already lost. The march into the woods began as a frenzy, but it felt almost like a funeral procession. Torches blazed, rifles gleamed, axes were raised high. The people of the town, their faces hollow from sleepless nights, moved together in grim silence. No one spoke of fear now. Fear had long since rotted into fury. At the very front, the preacher strode like a prophet of old, his Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other, declaring that God himself would guide their path. Children clung to their mothers at the edge of the crowd, watching their fathers vanish into the trees, not knowing if they would return. The forest swallowed them quickly. The torchlight seemed dim against the press of branches, and the chanting that had haunted them from a distance now grew louder, more rhythmic, pulsing like the beat of a monstrous heart. It was not the sound of dozens, nor even hundreds, it was something deeper, resonating with the very soil. The air grew thick with smoke, though no fire could yet be seen. And beneath it all was the faintest sound, a child's voice, thin and broken, carried between the trees. It called once, then again, as if begging to be found. The mob surged forward. Branches snapped beneath their boots. Some men shouted Eliza's name, though their cries were swallowed by the overwhelming chorus. Others muttered prayers. A few, those less consumed by rage, whispered that the sound was not Eliza at all, but a trick. A lure. But their warnings were lost in the roar of the crowd. At last they reached the clearing. It was as though the earth itself had prepared a stage for what awaited. The trees circled wide, their trunks blackened with soot, and in the center burned a fire that towered higher than the chapel steeple. Around it, cloaked figures moved in precise rhythm, their bodies swaying, arms raised, chanting words no one could understand. Symbols were carved into the ground, glowing faintly as if painted in blood and lit from beneath. And there, bound to a wooden frame like a crude altar, was Eliza. Her hair hung loose, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but she was alive. Her small chest heaved, her eyes wide with terror. A gag muffled her cries, but the sight of her was enough. The townsfolk screamed in fury and charged forward, weapons raised, torches blazing. The cult did not scatter. They did not run. They turned in perfect unison, as if one mind guided them all, and extended their arms toward the mob. The chanting grew louder, faster, until the very ground seemed to quake. And then the fire changed. What had been orange and red flared suddenly green, then blue, casting unnatural shadows across the clearing. Shapes danced in the flames, shapes that were not human. Some swore they saw horns, wings, leering faces. Others swore the flames whispered their names. The first gunshot cracked through the chaos, a rifle fired by a farmer who could bear no more. The bullet struck one of the cloaked figures, who fell with a cry. Blood spattered the ground. For an instant it seemed victory was possible, that the cult was nothing more than flesh and blood. But as the man's body writhed, the others broke their circle, not in retreat but in attack. With knives drawn, they leapt into the mob. The clearing erupted in violence. Torches clashed with blades, gunfire split the air, screams rose on every side. Men fought like animals, women clawed with their bare hands. The preacher, roaring scripture, fired his pistol again and again, each shot dropping another cultist. The constable swung his rifle like a club, knocking figures to the ground. And yet for every cultist that fell, another seemed to rise, their chants never faltering, their rhythm never broken. In the chaos, several men reached Eliza. They cut her bonds, pulled her from the frame, and carried her toward the edge of the clearing. She clung to them desperately, sobbing, her tiny hands smeared with blood. But just as they neared the tree line, she froze, eyes fixed on the flames. She pointed, trembling, as if trying to speak through her gag. The men turned, and saw. The fire had grown higher still, reaching toward the stars, and from it something began to emerge. At first it looked like smoke, curling upward in thick coils. Then it took shape. A figure, vast and monstrous, with a crown of horns and eyes like burning coals. Its body was not flesh but shadow, its limbs stretching impossibly long. The chants rose to a deafening crescendo as the creature stepped free of the flames, its very presence pressing the breath from the lungs of every living soul. Panic broke the mob. Some dropped their weapons and fled, vanishing into the woods with screams that echoed long after they were gone. Others fell to their knees, praying, begging for salvation. The preacher, standing his ground, raised his Bible high and shouted words that could not be heard over the roar. The creature's gaze fell upon him, and in an instant he burst into flame, screaming, writhing, consumed before the crowd's eyes. Chaos devoured the clearing. The cultists threw themselves into the fire, their bodies writhing as if offering themselves to the beast. The townsfolk who remained fought blindly, hacking and slashing at shadows that could not bleed. Some turned on each other, mistaking friend for foe in the madness. The constable tried to rally them, bellowing for order, but his voice was drowned out, his body swallowed in the crush of fleeing men. Through it all, Eliza's cries rang out. She had torn the gag from her mouth, screaming not for help but for them to stop. Her small voice pierced the night like a blade, crying words that made no sense, "It's not me. It's not me." But no one listened. They could not. The flames rose higher still, and the creature stretched its arms wide, as though claiming the entire town as its own. The earth trembled, trees split, the sky itself seemed to bleed red. And then, with a sound like thunder cracking open the heavens, the fire collapsed inward. A rush of wind blew through the clearing, extinguishing torches, silencing cries. When sight returned, the monster was gone. The cult was gone. The clearing lay in ashes, smoldering, empty. Only Eliza remained, lying on the ground where the men had dropped her. She was silent now, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. Slowly, she turned her head toward the survivors, those broken, bloody few who still stood. And in a voice not her own, deeper, older, echoing with something vast and cruel, she whispered, "You cannot kill what was already yours." The words froze them in place. Not one dared move, not one dared breathe. And then, as the last embers died, the forest fell into silence. The survivors carried Eliza back to town, though none could meet her gaze. None spoke of what they had seen. But in their hearts they knew, the cult had not been destroyed. It had only planted its seed. And that seed now lived among them. In the weeks that followed the night of fire, the town was no longer the same place it had been. The streets, once noisy with merchants' carts and children's laughter, became eerily silent. Windows were shuttered even in daylight, doors bolted against neighbors, and the faintest sound of a twig snapping was enough to send entire families into whispered prayer. The survivors of that night carried themselves like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their voices brittle. No one dared speak aloud what they had seen in the clearing. To name it was to give it power, and yet silence gave it more. The preacher was gone, his ashes scattered with the wind. The constable never returned. Some whispered he had been swallowed whole by the woods, others that he had fled, unable to carry the weight of failure. Of the cultists, nothing remained but footprints in ash and symbols carved into bark that bled sap like wounds. The clearing itself was avoided by all. Birds no longer sang there, animals did not cross it. Travelers who stumbled upon it claimed the soil was blackened and warm to the touch, as though something still burned beneath the surface. Eliza was returned to her family, but she was not the same child who had been taken. She spoke little, slept less, and when she did dream, her screams woke the entire household. Sometimes she laughed at things no one else could see. Other times she sat for hours, staring into the hearth fire until someone forced her away. The Miller family swore she was still their daughter, but even they could not deny the chill that clung to her presence, or the way her eyes seemed too old, too knowing, for a child of her years. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed Eliza had been marked by the devil, a vessel carrying the darkness back into the town. Others insisted she had always been the key, the reason the cult had risen in the first place. Parents forbade their children from playing near her home. Shopkeepers crossed themselves when she passed by. The few who dared approach her told unsettling tales, her voice echoing like two people speaking at once, her laughter cutting off into silence as though strangled mid-breath. The town tried to bury the memory. Families left, abandoning farms that had been in their blood for generations. Crops withered. Livestock sickened. Those who remained built higher fences, thicker walls, but no barrier could keep out what lingered in their minds. At night, some swore they heard chanting again, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Others awoke to find strange markings on their doors, drawn in soot or mud or something darker. When asked who could have left them, no one answered. Everyone suspected someone. Years passed, but the wound never healed. Children grew up in the shadow of that night, learning its story not from books but from the trembling lips of their elders. They learned that their town was cursed, that trust was a dangerous luxury, and that the forest was not to be entered after dark. Some left as soon as they were old enough, fleeing to cities where the shadows were man-made and predictable. Others stayed, bound by duty, by land, or by fear that leaving would not save them. And through it all, Eliza grew. She became a young woman, pale and quiet, with a gaze that unsettled even the boldest men. Suitors came at first, drawn by her beauty, but none stayed long. Some claimed her presence made them sick. Others swore she whispered to them in dreams, leading them into the woods. A few simply vanished. Her parents aged quickly, their faces lined not with time but with dread, as though every day with their daughter drained something from them. By the turn of the century, whispers of the town's curse had spread beyond its borders. Travelers avoided the place. Newspapers, when they mentioned it at all, spoke of it as a curiosity, a backwater plagued by superstition, a relic of darker times. But those who lived there knew better. They knew the evil had not left. It had only changed its shape, slipped deeper into the marrow of their lives. Some said the cult had never been destroyed, only scattered, its members hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Others said the cult was gone, but the thing it had worshipped had taken root in the town itself, feeding on grief and suspicion, growing stronger with every whispered doubt. But the most chilling theory of all was the simplest, that the town itself had become the cult, that every act of fear, every hushed accusation, every broken bond was part of the ritual continuing in silence. Eliza's story, too, twisted into legend. Some said she left the town, vanishing into the cities, carrying the curse with her. Others swore she died young, her body found in the same clearing where she had once been bound, the earth beneath her still warm to the touch. A few insisted she never aged at all, that she still walks the streets by lantern light, her face hidden beneath a shawl, her eyes glinting like embers in the dark. To this day, no one agrees on what happened that winter of 1897. Was it madness? A shared delusion fueled by fear and grief? Or was it something older, something the human mind cannot bear to face? The records are few, the testimonies contradictory. Some historians dismiss it entirely as folklore. Others, those who have stood in that abandoned clearing and felt the earth thrum beneath their feet, are not so quick to deny. But one truth lingers, undeniable as the chill in the air: something happened. Something that hollowed out an entire community, that burned itself into memory so deeply it still echoes more than a century later. And whether it was human cruelty, unholy ritual, or something in between, it left a scar that time has not erased. Even now, those who dare to pass through the town after dark claim to hear faint chanting in the trees. They claim to see faces watching from the shadows, blank and expressionless. And sometimes, if the night is very still, they swear they hear the voice of a child, whispering from the darkness, "You cannot kill what was already yours."